Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer, welcome to my channel. And after what felt like a little bit of time, because some of them were junkers, I have now finished the International Booker Prize shortlist for 2022. And my what a shortlist. I've got 4 of them here, but I'll be talking, hang on, how do I balance these? I'll be talking about all 6. These are just the ones I have physical copies of. But it is just so fascinating to read so many books in translation, particularly often from languages that are not as often translated into English in a big kind of commercial way, and also just to explore these vast, weird and wonderful worlds that we kind of have access to through these books. And I'm going to be talking about all 6 and sort of talking about the ones that I'm sort of hoping will win. But I will say overall, I think this is a really phenomenal shortlist. I mean, prize lists are always a thing, you know. Sometimes a shortlist might have only 1 or 2 that you really like. Sometimes you like all of them. But I have to say this is, I think, a particularly well chosen shortlist. It feels like a really broad range of books and types of book and really different types of stories and writing. And I also just really think it's worth acknowledging just the incredible work that translators have done in these 6 books, because, I mean, you know, including the fact that somebody had to, you know, poor Jennifer Croft, I think it was, yeah, had to translate all 900 pages of this. So, you know, it's a big task, and there is something so incredible about being able to find something, a rhythm or the way a book works in its own language and translate that somehow into another one. So really delighted to be talking about all 6 of these, and let's get started. So going first by the alphabetically from the surnames of the authors, at least in the original language, we have Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, which is translated by Anton. And this is a selection of short stories, and a really quite bizarre one. I know this has been, I think, probably the most Marmite book of the entire shortlist. It is given that the opening few stories of this involve some really quite grotesque and grim, horrific things, in a way that I found really quite mixed across the collection. So I really enjoyed the first 2, even though they are really gruesome and grotesque, and it deals with a lot of aspects of Korean society. And so actually what I thought was clever and the sort of saving grace of some of the grotesque aspects of the short stories was how they sort of seem to tie into something about society. So the fact that we have a story about this sort of, how to describe this, a monster that is essentially created out of body fluids, but particularly feces, yeah, and it kind of keeps growing, and it's sort of this thing where it eventually sort of becomes almost sentient, and there's a sort of grotesque moment of sort of what it is then going to do, but it weirdly makes some kind of quite interesting commentaries on parenting and on adulthood and sort of women's role in the family and all these sorts of things, which I thought was really fascinating. So I kind of overlooked the grotesquerie of it all, because there's almost a tongue-in-cheek aspect of it. It's so grotesque and grim that it's actually quite funny, because it sort of is playing with this idea that this is horrendous and incredibly gross. However, I then sort of, as the collection sort of carried on, it sort of fell off a bit for me. I think maybe the first 2 stories, when I read them, had the benefit of the shock factor of being so grotesque and out there that I was like, yeah, let's go with this. This is kind of fun. And then sort of eventually, as it went on, I was like, so I did get a little bit bored, I have to admit, by sort of towards the end. And that's nothing necessarily about the writing itself. Just I struggle with short stories anyway, and I think I almost need short stories to feel like they're either connected to some kind of political or moral point, or to just be really playful and fun and silly. And it kind of fell in the middle ground for me sort of towards the end, where I didn't feel that much of a connection. So it's probably safe to say this is not necessarily my top choice for winner, but I see entirely why it's on this shortlist. I think of the entire long list, and I've only read a couple of others that were on the long list outside of the one shortlisted, and there are a couple I probably would have chosen over this, but I also see that this is so polarizing and so intriguing that you probably would go for something like this. It adds to a bit of a variety for this for the shortlist, and Anton was even shortlisted for another book longlisted for another book on for the International Booker as well, Love in the Big City, which is also quite fun. Next up, we have a new name, Septology 6 to 7 by Fosse, which was translated by Damion Searls. And I've done a separate video on this, but this book goes into a lot of thoughts around religion and art and memory, and how those three things intersect. But particularly we follow the lives of a few characters, particularly one man called Asle in Norway, who is a painter, and he keeps on basically painting these thoughts that he has in his life and in his mind, and he can't quite seem to sort of exercise this demon almost in his mind. He has to keep painting to kind of get these images out, but you can see there's this sort of struggle and sort of trouble there, because there's almost a fear. What happens when he feels like he's exercised that demon? Is he no longer going to create? What happens when what happens if, is there another way that he can think about this memory and really process it? And really what we then end up with is this really quite bizarre but interesting story told in one continuous sentence. Like I said, this is Septology 6 and 7, and so it's sort of split into two parts naturally, and each part, and that includes the 5 other parts that were in 2 other books, ends with a sort of prayer. And that does mean that as we lurch towards the end of this book, we expect this prayer that's going to end this book in a sort of appeal to God almost. And it's really quite a bizarre book in many, many ways. I can see why a lot of people struggle with it. The one run-on sentence thing can be a bit much. But actually, I think that really adds to this sort of breathlessness of this book. There's a real energy to it that's driving it forward, this desperate sort of search to find memory and to understand what thoughts this character has had. And I think I found that so captivating, just this idea of how does he sort of work out who he is, and particularly a big part of trying to work out who he is we are introduced to the namesake, who is somebody who has his same name, and at times we're sort of meant to question whether this is the same person, or if they're not the same person, how do their lives intersect in various ways. So quite a bizarre one on the list, but again, like with Cursed Bunny, I think it makes sense on a shortlist. It's something that maybe not everybody's going to love, but for those who do really get a lot from it are going to really love it. And also it feels like nothing I've really read before. It looks at art and memory and religion in really poignant ways, and this sort of desperate search to find God and to find meaning and to find memory and all these sorts of things feels so real and sort of almost quite tragic at times. And yeah, I think I found it really quite beautiful for that reason. I think a few people have loved it a little bit more than I have. I think it was a good solid 4 stars, 8, pushing up towards maybe a 5. I know some people have sort of finished this really breathlessly and just sort of like, yeah, and I see that, I totally get that. And I did kind of get to the end of this book. I actually struggled a bit more with this one than with the first 2. I think I just knew that I was going to have to approach it in one big push. Like I couldn't just sort of sit there and do like, 20 pages here or there, especially as there are no chapters. So I think as a result, I kept on putting it off because I knew I wanted some time. And then I was dog sitting the lovely Annie, and just was like, right, sod it, and gave it, just read 150 pages in this sort of big stream, and sort of big gulp, and absolutely loved it. So yeah, a really interesting book. And I'm really curious to check out other things by Fosse now as well, to kind of see which of these themes sort of permeates other bits of his writing as well. Next, we have Heaven by Mieko Kawakami, and this is translated from the Japanese by Sam Bett and David Boyd. And this story largely is focused around a high school in Japan, and particularly how teenagers' lives interact with each other. And it's particularly how their lives interact when they are kind of these misfits. There's a character who's bullied, There's one character who has sort of given up bathing. It's kind of, as a result, created this situation where nobody really wants to touch them, but also they have to wrangle with some of the trickiest and most complex things in their lives. So not only the difficulties of being a teenager and sort of puberty and everything else like that, but also sort of navigating an environment in which they are not up there. They're not popular, they're not seemingly not really loved by many people, and they occupy a very weird space within the whole school. And their friendship seems to be this sort of lighthouse almost to each other in these sort of troubled waters. But equally at the same time, that some of these relationships in the book are already quite destructive. They're not necessarily helping each other, they're more just sort of watching each other as the boat sinks. You know, it's sort of, I don't know why there's a lot of water sort of imagery coming out in my head from this, but it then sort of becomes this really interesting scenario where these two characters feel, particularly these sort of two central characters, feel kind of doomed almost, because we sort of know that their lives are going to be horrible. We see an astonishing amount of violence coming from not only their fellow students, but also from teachers. And even if the teachers aren't perpetuating the violence, they are also not stopping it. And so there's this really horrible, toxic atmosphere around these characters that's really quite impenetrable and really quite tricky. And so these characters are just sort of stuck here and must sort of recount things to each other. I will say it didn't always fully work for me. Overall, I enjoyed the book. I just think, I don't know, at times it felt a bit much. But again, I know that that's what has made it appeal to so many people as well, that there is this kind of intensity to the book. But you know, I think even if it's not necessarily my choice for winner, I still think it's a remarkable achievement, and really interesting to see how these things kind of interact. And I know lots of people have loved it for that as well. But yeah, not necessarily my pick, but an interesting book for a shortlist nonetheless. I've also done a separate video on this one. It is Claudia Piñeiro's Eleanors Nose, which is translated by Francis Riddle, published by the wonderful Charco Press. And this book, as anyone who's seen my video talking about how much I loved it can attest, I think this is a masterpiece. I genuinely think this is just an incredible piece of work, done over about 150 pages. I genuinely don't know how she's done it in 150 pages. I don't know how you contain that much story and that much development and sort of trickery into 150 pages. It's so poignant, it's so beautiful, it made me almost cry at one point. And I read it in pretty much almost one go, just a little break in between, and just absolutely flew through it because I just think this is stunning. So the story overall is about a woman with Parkinson's disease, our central character, Elena, who is trying to understand the death of her daughter, and particularly how it happened. People around her are saying it's suicide, she doesn't believe that, and she gives her own reasons for why that is. But equally, as we're following through that part of the book, we also see how her relationship with her body is a big part of this book as well. Her sort of oncoming Parkinson's disease is really stripping her of the ability to do some tasks that she previously was able to do alone. And so as a result, there's a dependency that's there potentially on other people. But Rita, her daughter, has just died, so she doesn't quite know how to deal with this and process it. And in the midst of trying to work it out, she's almost like a detective running around trying to solve this crime. But equally, she is fighting her own body and fighting her limitations. And I was so struck by this book. I just think it's phenomenal. I literally could go on about it for hours, which is probably longer than how long it actually took me to read it. But there is a passage where she talks about where they're at the doctor's talking about the realities of her illness and what that's probably going to look like. Absolutely heartbreaking. Someone, you know, for me, myself, I have elderly parents, and the nuance of that situation is captured so beautifully, I think, here, of understanding that children can have quite complicated feelings towards their parents' illnesses, because it's not only mourning, it's sort of, you know, mourning the potential loss of your parent, it's also thinking about how you're going to look after them. It's a helplessness, it's a fear, it's anger, it's a feeling of injustice, it's so many things. And this book, I think, captures it so beautifully. So all of that is basically just to say, this is one of my picks for winner. I think it's a masterpiece. I realise I've said that a few times recently about some books, but I do genuinely believe it. I think this is a really stunning piece of work. I think it deserves a really big audience, and I really would love to see it win the International Booker. I think it's strong enough. I think it holds up to multiple rereads, and I just think it's such a stunning way of looking at the world. And also the translation of this is incredible to capture some of that pace that the book has. So yeah, really impressed by this, and really rooting for it as well. Next, we come to the first of the two chunkers on this list, and that is Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, translated by Daisy Rockwell and published by Tilted Axis Press, who had 3 of their books on the long list, which is kind of remarkable. And this is about 700 pages, but does not feel that way because many of the pages are quite short. The pace of this book is really quite fast, and particularly the middle section of this book has lots of blank pages and lots of pages with very few words on them. So actually you just sort of really fly through this book. It doesn't feel like a 700 pager. And it focuses on a woman who is reflecting on her memories of a time pre-partition for India, and particularly what that has then meant since India partitioned, or was forced to. And her kind of recollections of her memory also integrate with her family all around her, who are trying to understand everything that's going on, and they sort of see her as this sort of old woman who is, you know, has had a really nice good life, but is now a bit, you know, either not necessarily confused, but, you know, they're like, look, you've got to look after yourself, you can't be doing all these crazy things or whatever. And she has this sort of real force of character to kind of think, no, I'm going to go and do this. And without really giving anything away, the way that her understanding of her past and her wish to remember things plays out actually has quite a significant impact on her and on everybody around her. She sort of takes steps that seem quite illogical but make entire sense with everything. And it's translated from Hindi, the first time that we've had a Hindi book on the shortlist, or on the long list, I believe, even, for the International Booker, which is very exciting. And it's just such a glorious book. I found it so playful and inventive and creative. Quite regularly throughout the book, we bounce between words and ideas, and there's this sort of play, sort of almost tug of war with language, of sort of someone saying something and somebody else thinking something else and bouncing off it, and all of these sorts of bits of silliness is going on. And I found it so captivating how the book manages to achieve that. And I did a solo review of it where I spoke about how much I just adore this book, and I just think this is a really cleverly done book. Not only the original, which I'm assuming, you know, which apparently has a lot of that playfulness, but also to be able to translate that playfulness into another language, particularly when so much of the playfulness is wordplay. Like, that is almost, you know, writing a whole book yourself, you know, and kind of trying to make that thing happen. So I found this book just so heartfelt and beautiful, but also really fun and engaging, and also really quite serious when it needed to be, and talking about some really big important issues really cleverly. And so I think currently, as you may be able to tell, these two, you know, Eleanors Nose and Tomb of Sand are my 2 favourites for the prize. I just think they're both stunning. But yeah, Tomb of Sand I think is definitely well worth checking out. Don't be put off by the length of this book. It is, I think, a masterpiece, and I think I'm really rooting for it. Last but not least, and I hate to end on a bit of a sort of bum note here, but The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, translated by Jennifer Croft, published by Fitzcarraldo, if you couldn't already tell by the blue. And this is the one that I think, going into the shortlist, well, going into the prize generally, even the long list, this was assumed that it was going to make it, partly just because Olga Tokarczuk is a former winner, so her book would automatically be entered anyway. It is a book that is, like, in sort of the original Polish, is sort of seen as her magnum opus and this sort of masterpiece. It was sort of part of the reason why she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. It was sort of noted in the sort of the speech notes for sort of, you know, them talking about why the prize had been awarded to Olga Tokarczuk. it was sort of noted that, you know, she'd kind of created these big works that spanned history. And I sort of done a separate video on this book, so I won't go into too much detail. I think I just sort of struggled with it. I had a few challenges with it. I think it's very easy with a book of this size to be intimidated by its size, and that's, I think, kind of a bit what happened with me, where I think I approached it as a task to be ticked off as opposed to a book to really be enjoyed at times. So I really wish I'd taken a little bit more time with it. I wish I'd started it earlier and sort of drip fed little bits of it, because I think trying to take in 70 or 100 pages or whatever at a time of this book is a lot. It's a big weighty one, but it deals with this character of Jacob at the center, who is sort of seen in many ways as sort of being this sort of wandering soul, almost this sort of nomadic character who kind of comes to these different towns and brings with him this sort of knowledge of a new way of thinking, particularly around religion. And this is a time of sort of turmoil in Europe. I might put this down, it's hurting my arm. It's a time of turmoil in Europe, with so many of the countries that we now think of as being, you know, sort of fairly fixed in their borders, were changing quite regularly, where some of these borders and towns were really quite fluid about who they belonged to, and where they were drawn. And we kind of get, you know, kind of go through a huge sort of swathe of history in a really important way. So I think this book is meticulously researched. It's also got, you know, sort of, I'll try and find a good example now. It's also got documents and sort of things on pages that are there as well. There's these sort of curios, but also as a sort of an addition. It's almost like, you know, submitting your resources, your references at the end of an essay. It kind of is like having that throughout this book, of sort of having these moments of, you know, here's the map that she was consulting, here's this old medical guide, here's this other thing. And so it is really impressive. It's an achievement to have created a book like this. And I know many people loved it, and particularly fell into this world and were so absorbed by it, and particularly the level of detail and how rich it is. And, you know, halfway through, I mentioned in my weekly wrap up that I was really enjoying it, because I was halfway through. I was in it, I was enjoying the rhythm of it. As I just sort of went on, I just got a bit lost. And at one point I did almost just start crying, because I was like, I was sort of sat there reading being like, I feel so stupid because I have no idea what's going on. But also I'm like 600 pages into a 900 page book, and there's no way I'm going back 300 pages to like understand where I'm up to. But all of that said, I, in some ways, would not be surprised, and I wouldn't be sad if it won the International Booker Prize, partly because I think it's clearly a big achievement of work. It's clearly a book that lots of people have read and really taken something from, but just in terms of personal winners, it's not mine. I would much rather see a couple of other books win, but I also have to recognise the real work that's gone into this, particularly translating something like this as well. Like, that's a big undertaking, and it's really deeply impressive. But yeah, I think not necessarily for me, but a book that I still think, you know, particularly if you're into historical fiction, would really enjoy. I have to admit, you know, I sometimes struggle a bit with historical fiction. Somebody, I think it was Paula from Draw Your Book, put in the comments of the video where I was talking about it, saying, you know, kind of making a comparison to something like Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which I think is a perfect comparison in the sense that it's a fairly dense historical novel, and if you know a bit of the history, it helps to kind of speed it along, because I struggled with Wolf Hall mostly on the writing sense, but actually I could get through because I knew enough of the historical stuff, to give it its technical term. And in something like the Books of Jacob, I don't know the history that well. So if I'm lost by who a character is, and I'm lost where the history is, I'm just stuck. I'm just a bit lost. So I think that's what happened a few times here, but I also totally would get it if it won. And that does bring us to the end of thinking about these 6 books stacked side by side. And let me just get some of them out, and I've now listed them across the room. Of the 4 that I've got here, that I physically own, plus Curse Bunny and Heaven, it's quite the shortlist, and I would, as I sort of mentioned, I would love to see either Eleanors Nose or Tomb of Sand take it. For me, these are my 2 winners. I think they both push the form of the novel to do new things and to take on new challenges. I think they're both deeply personal and political and sort of say a lot about the wider world. And I think they're both astonishing in terms of how they're written, both assuming how the original was written and in how they've been translated. I think they're both very highly deserving for me because of just the absolute achievement of them both to create something that, for me, I just think both of them were just such great reading experiences for really different reasons. But I think are kind of fairly phenomenal. Again, though, wouldn't be surprised if any of the others won, just because I think it's kind of anyone's game. I mean, Olga Tokarczuk could well do a double and win a second time. I think Fosse also has a good shout, and I think, you know, the other two books, it's not particularly, you know, it's not unheard of that those could maybe win. But I've got my favourites. I'd love to hear yours, and particularly how you got on with reading the shortlist. And yeah, it's also intriguing to think what from the long list didn't make this shortlist that you'd have loved to see. I think I probably would have loved to have seen David Grossman's More Than I Love My Life on there. But then I don't think I've read that many more of the long list, so I haven't really got many more to compare. But really intrigued to hear your thoughts. I've been Bob the Booker. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.